I'm a big fan of open world games, and I remember when I first launched The Witcher 3 almost 10 years ago, playing it at a very low frame rate. And no, the Nintendo Switch hadn't been released yet, I just didn't have a powerful PC. But despite the numerous bugs and low FPS, I was fascinated by this game, and all because of an incredible open world that I hadn't seen in any previous game. But what's worse, I won't see it in almost every game that follows. Since the release of The Witcher 3, we've seen dozens of other big open world projects. Some of them were quite good, and we'll talk about them today, but most of the games were just bad. The game worlds not only remained the same as they were 10 or even 15 years ago, but they degraded. But why? Why did the big game studios that once created new standards for open world games just start creating big maps that made no sense? Why is it that when you play a new Assassin's Creed, Outlaws, Starfield, or almost every new game, you get bored in the beginning and you just force yourself to play on because you just bought this shit? And this feeling is very different from when you were a kid and you were enthusiastic about exploring the world of Skyrim or the third Fallout. In fact, the degradation of modern open worlds is not due to the greed of large corporations that just want to make a new game quickly to make money. It's also not because modern developers are lazy or incompetent enough because they were hired through the DEI program rather than because of their professional qualifications. In fact, most open world games have degraded so much because game studios, for whatever reason, started making three fundamental mistakes. These problems have started to occur more and more often in the game industry, which personally makes me very worried about the future of open world games. And the first reason is the lack of a meaningful story. The third Witcher had something I hadn't seen in any open world game before. Its entire huge map was filled with deep side quests that developed the plot and the world. Every corner of the open world had its own story, atmosphere, and unique characters. This created the feeling that the vast expanses of the continent were not just very beautiful, but also important and alive. But now, we see how Ubisoft can still create a beautiful landscape, but this beautiful picture is devoid of any emotional connection with the player. Why should I give a fuck about beautifully drawn trees if there's nothing to do between those trees, or the beautiful and detailed landscapes, if I'm forced to do the same thing for the whole game for dozens of hours, which often has nothing to do with the main story? And the story itself is often created just to be there. Previously, we used to play good story-driven games with an open world as a bonus. Now we play an open world that just tries to keep us engaged for more hours, where the bonus is a template plot that no one gives a shit about. For this genre of games, a good story, both main and side stories, must not be just good, but very good. If a new Call of Duty or other game with linear levels has an average story, it won't be a big deal. But in games that intend to engage us for 50 or even 70 hours, you have to give us a story that will grab us and keep us engaged, and not collecting the same collectibles or destroying the same outposts. Unfortunately, this is a big problem for modern open world games. Weak, superficial story, or its almost complete absence. The story is the foundation that unites all the elements of the game, gives it meaning, and motivates the player to explore the world. In the past, games like The Witcher 3 or RDR2 offered players deep, multi-layered stories that affected emotions and created a connection with the characters. But now, we see how developers often sacrifice stories for the sake of scale. A huge world filled with question marks on a map cannot compensate for the lack of a quality story. Once upon a time, Ubisoft was one of those who laid the foundations for this genre. This company was the one that knew how to combine a good adult story with an open world. Even before going bankrupt, Ubisoft had so many good and financially successful franchises that it could easily have become the new Rockstar. But it didn't. The latest games in their Assassin's Creed and Far Cry series are just shameful limitations of their franchises. Behind the slight improvements in graphics, we see a massive degradation in the story. Valhalla has the most boring story in the history of the entire franchise, and at the same time, it is the longest game in the entire Assassin's Creed series. For more than 100 hours, you have to walk around a huge world in which the main story simply dissolves into endless quests of the same type. A weak story and a lot of unnecessary icons on the map make the game boring as hell. Without a clear motivation or emotional involvement, every quest and every location seems empty, even if they are technically filled with content. And this is not just my words full of hatred for Ubisoft, it's simple statistics. More than 40% of Assassin's Creed's Valhalla players didn't even reach England and quit the game right after the prologue. That's 4 fucking hours of game. 4 out of more than 100 hours that thousands of developers have been working on for several years, and which turned out to be useless to anyone. And this happens not only with Assassin's Creed. A quarter of Starfield players couldn't even complete the first mission, even though it's only the first 30 minutes of the game. And only 17% of players completed the first part of the main story of Star Wars Outlaws. Although I don't think that's a lot, considering that 17% of everyone who bought this game is also about 17 people. But still, we see that compared to old games that are replayed from time to time, new games from the same developers become uninteresting for most people at the beginning of the story because of its superficiality and general shitty nature. Stories, both main and side, in modern open world games suck. And why is that? It's pretty damn simple. It's the desire of big publishers to reach a wider audience. Developers create worlds that are aimed at everyone, avoiding complex or risky plots that could lose some players. This is very strange because we see specific examples when a good story could have a relatively empty world. Mafia 2 had a small and static world with minimal interactive elements, but I gave a shit. The story was great. LA Noire had a big but empty Los Angeles with absolutely nothing to do. Who cares? It was a good tense detective story. Another great example is Death Stranding. If not for the brilliant story, no one would play this game with its monotonous gameplay and empty open world. And I'm not saying that the story is the most important thing for open world games, but it's definitely the thing that makes the world worthwhile for the player. But the game studios don't give a fuck about the quality of the story. Another fundamental problem is the lack of interactivity, which makes the world alive and, to some extent, realistic. Now I will ask you about something that is very difficult for a person who loves video games. Think about what surrounds you when you go out. No matter how long ago it was, try to remember the sounds, smells, people, and cars. Hundreds of thousands of details surround us in the real world, and you can interact with all these details. Everything has a meaning. Now, look at what open worlds in video games often try to surprise us with. The same thing porn actors do, with a large size. But why do we need a large size if there's nothing to do there? Developers, such as the fucking Ubisoft, often fill their words with a lot of secondary content, useless collectibles, outposts, and meaningless quests that just repeat throughout the game. But none of this gives us true interactivity. Even though we have to spend dozens of hours on useless grind, it doesn't change anything in the game world. Just remember what interactivity looks like in Rockstar games, and it's important to understand that I'm not talking about side quests here. In RDR2, we had main story quests and side story quests for characters that stretched for over several separate missions, creating separate story arcs. But in addition to all of this, we also had random events that had nothing to do with either the main story or the side storylines. And these small and random stories were also a great way to make the open world more alive. Every time you rode your horse from one mission to the next, you would encounter some motherfuckers who wanted to rob you, or who were just going about their business that affected you and the game world. NPCs behaved as if they were living their own lives independently of the player. And the main thing is that the game allows you to interact with it. That's why most open world games feel empty and predictable, even though they're filled with NPCs or all sorts of unnecessary activities. It all feels static, patterned, and just repetitive. And that's really a shame because Watch Dogs Legion, Avatar, and even Assassin's Creed Mirage show that Ubisoft is not that crooked yet, because the worlds in these games look pretty good. But the beauty of the world is not supported by anything. It's like pouring water into a Coke can. Yes, now the water looks good, but no one wants to drink this shit. Another problem is that Ubisoft's game development model has somehow become the standard for the industry. Other studios started adding similar mechanics to their games. This can be seen in Horizon Zero Dawn or Cyberpunk 2077, where most of the activities seem to be content for content's sake. A lot of question marks, but do you really need them? As a result, the open world genre loses value, becoming more of a tedious task than an exciting experience. Of course, nobody wants to copy the Rockstar model, when the entire map is dotted with details and interactive zones because it took you decades to develop the game. But still, why do we need a big world if there is nothing to do with it? But this is not even the main problem with open worlds in modern games. The main problem is the lack of attention developers pay to other aspects of the game. For whatever reason, game studios have started to give a fuck about gameplay, new mechanics, and optimization. Maps are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But is it enough? No. Modern developers. Okay, Maybe it would be better to say their bosses, or rather the publishers who give them the money to develop games. So these cocksuckers in suits are not interested in making sure that you have a good time in their next game. They are interested in making sure that you have a lot of time. Think about it logically. Will a horse's balls getting smaller in the cold increase the number of hours it takes to complete a game? Of course not. Are the intricate detective stories that are scattered all over the map and which are too complicated for the average Assassin's Creed fan? Also no. Firstly, great attention to detail and the creation of interesting mechanics requires a high level of creativity, which the developers certainly do not have. And secondly, over the years, we see how players are simply comfortable doing the same thing throughout the game just to be able to move on with the plot. That is why the industry is stagnant. Why change if it works this way? Every year we get the same game but in a different package. The same mechanics, the same story, the same gameplay, only a different environment. Also, other aspects of the game can suffer when developers deliberately move to the open world. What do I mean by that? In the gaming industry, there have been cases when a franchise switched to open world gameplay and other content suffered in order to support this very large open world. A good example of this is the Mafia series. I like this series. The first and second Mafia had fairly small maps. In fact, it's just one city where plot events take place. But absolutely nothing happens in this city. Yes, there are small interactions, you can customize a character or rob something, but mostly because there is nothing to do on the map. You just move through the story and hardly pay attention to anything else. So we can say that there is no open world in the game as such. But when Mafia 3 came out, something changed. We see some new patterns that were not inherent in the first two parts but rather resembled traditional open world game mechanics. Most likely, Hangar 13 developers paid attention to Ubisoft's working model of open worlds when developing this game. Open world games are in high demand, and ordinary companies see it as an easy way to increase sales. That is why they put territory capture, collecting unnecessary stuff, and other traditional Ubisoft mechanics into their games. But the more time developers spend on making the world bigger and more similar to other franchises, the less time they have for other aspects of the gameplay. That's why Mafia 3 is so different from its predecessors. Instead of focusing on just a good linear story, we got a buggy Far Cry with territory capture, which also looked bad. The creators of Mafia 3 decided not to imitate their predecessors, but to direct the franchise into the standard open world model, which, firstly, bored everyone, and secondly, does not suit the series at all, with its deep criminal plot that does not overload with unnecessary activities. As a result, we got a shitty Mafia 3 and bankrupted Ubisoft. And you know, I was quite pleasantly surprised when I saw the trailer for the next Mafia. It looks like the series is going back to its roots. The location will be in Sicily. I don't think it will be a big map. Most likely, it will be a linear game with a good dramatic plot that will take 10 to 12 hours to complete, everything we liked about the first two Mafias. However, this franchise is not the only one that suffered because the developers wanted to clumsily switch to the open world model. We can see how the approach to mission creation is changing in the latest Call of Duty games. And you can call me a shithead, but I really prefer the usual levels where we stupidly go from point A to point B, killing NPCs at the same time. I don't see Call of Duty as a multi-layered masterpiece of the gaming industry. For me, it's more like another Michael Bay movie where everything explodes. There's a cliched plot about tough guys and gameplay that doesn't require any thinking. But I just recently finally finished the Black Ops 6 story campaign, and I see how Raven Software is trying to move away from the typical model of the series. And yes, they managed to do something new. Most of the game takes place on large maps, and sometimes very large, as in one of the missions in the desert. But for me personally, these were the worst levels. You drive around the desert, just doing the same thing. It looks like Activision just wanted to artificially increase the game's time. Since they received a lot of hate for the last part, they decided not to create more levels, but just to make them long and boring, because it's cheaper and much faster. Of course, we can't say that Call of Duty is now an open world game, but if that ever really happens, oh man, I think it will be terrible. So open world games are dying, and it sounds very paradoxical because every year there are more and more of them, and a large audience still plays this genre, but all these projects are the same. They have no authenticity, and developers just make the same mistakes. So, I spilled a lot of shit, but I didn't offer anything. How do I see the solution to this problem? Well, it's very simple. First, stop making big maps. Nobody needs them. If you can't fill them with good content, just don't make them. The next thing is NPCs. Successful open worlds like Red Dead Redemption 2 show that NPCs can create the illusion of a living environment. They have to react to the player's actions, have their own things to do, and remember if the player has done certain things. It should not be like Far Cry 6, where NPCs are just static decorations that repeat the same actions, which quickly kills the sense of reality. Also, dear game creators, start creating normal side quests. A good example is The Witcher 3. I still remember a side quest where I had to go in search of a missing man, and a normal quest turned into a whole story about loss and revenge. Also, take care of the rewards. Collecting dozens of unnecessary 3D models in boxes is not interesting. I'm reminded of Mafia 2 when you had to find all the Playboy posters on the map. It was appropriate. You collect all the posters that you can then jerk off to. It's a good mechanic. And if this sounds too much for you, you can remember The Last of Us, where we collected cards with superheroes in different locations or something like that. I explored every nook and cranny, and I really wanted to find them, because there was a story behind these cards. The writers first explained to us the importance of these cards, and then I wanted to find them all myself because it was important for the characters and their world. It wasn't just another achievement to complete the game 100%, it was part of the story. And finally, my dear developers, please find a balance between scale and content. If the publisher is greedy and doesn't give you the funds to create a big and good game, just make a good one. We don't need big open worlds. We need good open worlds.